All right, hello everybody. So today we have a talk by Professor Gray. This talk is hosted by the Humanist League. It's a club that I'm the president of. We meet for discussion meetings on Wednesdays at 4:30 in Wing 5302. We can put you on our mailing list if you'd like. We also have cool speaker events like this one. We try to have one a semester. We can also tell you about those. But I'm really looking forward to this talk, which is going to be about structure, justice, and exploitation, taking a more philosophical, like expanding our philosophical views of things like justice. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Gray.
All right, thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. It's always good to see so many CMU students interested in free pizza. So can you hear me okay? Good? Okay. What I'm going to do today, and let me get this out of the way. I will follow the kind of like standard philosophy talk procedure, which is I'll just talk for a while and then I'll take questions. So hold your questions to the end, please. So today I'll be drawing on work in progress, co-authored with Professor Danielle Wenner, also in the CMU philosophy department. I'll be pointing out a problem with certain kinds of normative theorizing. And here where I say normative, I mean it appeals to norms. So it's prescriptive, not descriptive. It's about how people and institutions ought to be or ought to act, not so much how they actually do act. And I want to show how this problem materializes in current debates about exploitation in sweatshop labor and international clinical trials. I'm hoping to show that this theorizing is ideological in the really bad way, in that it makes erroneous assumptions about the nature and background of global exploitation, and in doing so, its prescriptions and evaluations function to legitimize and reproduce the very injustice enabling further exploitation. More specifically, it fails to take into account how exploitation is a product of social structures, and how social structures are a product of human actions, perhaps some humans more than others. And I'm hoping to talk about how to theorize in these spaces without being ideological. So in our paper, we talk about two commonly discussed claims of exploitation in low and middle income countries, or I'll now refer to them as LMICs. Sweatshop labor and international clinical trials. In each case, there's a worry that individuals or groups in wealthy countries are wrongly taking advantage of those in LMICs. So in sweatshop labor, I'm talking about labor that pays very little relative to, say, the final price of the goods made, relative to worker pay in wealthier countries, and relative even to what's needed to afford a decent life. I'm also talking about very long hours, working under very poor conditions, sometimes even dangerous conditions. The worry here is that sweatshop owners and or the multinational corporations which do business with these factories, or even consumers in wealthier countries, might be taking advantage of the lack of better alternatives for workers in LMICs. So LMIC workers are willing to accept less than their counterparts in wealthy countries who have better alternatives. And the lower costs of labor in LMICs lowers the price of the final goods and increases perhaps profits. The other context of global exploitation we discuss is international clinical trials. Pharmaceutical research sponsors in wealthy countries, and this includes pharmaceutical companies themselves, but also government health agencies, often carry out research in LMIC populations. It's often cheaper to fund research in these settings for various reasons. Sometimes sponsors make use of a lower standard of care in these countries, meaning less is expected of them in terms of what they must provide participants. And successful interventions or drugs often are not made available to these populations after the completion of the trial. And so it's often claimed that conducting trials in LMICs is wrongly exploitative. I want to turn now to how exploitation is theorized. How is it that theorists tackle claims about exploitation, including these kinds of global exploitation? Well, we can distinguish between theories of structural exploitation on the one hand and on the other interpersonal exploitation. Structural exploitation is a perhaps necessary product of certain structural features within society. For example, Marxist exploitation, understood as the transfer of surplus value from workers to capitalists, is a necessary feature of the class structure under capitalism, which itself is based on the system of property rights underlying capitalism. Structural exploitation is often taken as conceptually tied to the justice or injustice of society as a whole. Not so with interpersonal exploitation. This is exploitation as a moral wrong, which one individual or individual entity could commit against another. This kind of exploitation is often taken as conceptually independent of larger structural features like the system of production, the choice of economy, something like that. Although it's allowed that some structural features can make interpersonal exploitation more common. Importantly, global exploitation of the kinds we discuss is often analyzed as a kind of interpersonal exploitation, so as a kind of moral wrong. So I'll talk a little bit more about interpersonal exploitation here. Think of exploitation, as most people do, I guess, as taking advantage. Immoral or wrongful exploitation of this kind will be something like this. A exploits B if and only if A wrongfully takes advantage of B. And just so you know, from here on out, A in my examples will always be the potential exploiter, and B will be the person who's potentially exploited. So A exploits B if and only if A wrongfully takes advantage of B, but what does that mean? That doesn't really tell us very much. What does it mean to wrongly take advantage of someone? Well, there are some easy cases and there are harder cases. Among the easy cases, you'll find just outright harmful exploitation. This is where A benefits from using B in a way that leaves B worse off. That's a pretty straightforward wrongful thing to do. Then there's non-consensual exploitation, where A wrongfully benefits from using B without B's consent. And A might do this through coercion, deceit, manipulation, fraud. Any of these things might undermine B's ability to consent. And this would be another fairly straightforward case of wronging someone by exploiting them. But there are harder cases. Some allegedly wrongly exploitative interactions seem to be both consensual and mutually beneficial. Here is an example from Mikhail Waldman. He calls it antidote. Person B is bitten by a rare poisonous snake. There's always people like near death in philosophy examples. I don't get it. Person B is bitten by a rare poisonous snake while hiking in a remote forest. Even better. His death is imminent. There we go. Fortunately, another hiker, A, happens by and offers to sell B the antidote. Though it retails for $10, A insists that he will accept no less than $20,000. Since B would rather lose his money than his life, he accepts A's offer. Okay, so that's the antidote example. I'll be referring back to that. Here's another one I call Snowstorm Rescuer. I borrow this with some embellishment from Alan Wertheimer. B's car has broken down on a rural highway in the midst of a snowstorm. A local, drives around looking for stranded motorists, knowing he might be able to make a good deal of money from offering to help them. In fact, he finds B, who is stranded, and B pays handsomely for the assistance. So both of these examples are considered by many people to be paradigmatic cases of wrongful exploitation. But if so, they're examples seemingly of this kind of mutually advantageous consensual exploitation, which I'll be shortening to MACE, as other people do in the literature. To talk about MACE is to talk about just this kind of like exploitation in which it seems like people consent and actually both parties benefit. So no obvious defects are found in B's ability to give consent. It seems like morally transformative consent has actually been given. A and B are both better off as a result of interacting. Their interaction creates what we call a social surplus, meaning a net gain over not transacting. Yet it still seems like A has wrongly taken advantage of B in some way that we want to call exploitative. And you might had a thought about, say, like the antidote example. If something bugged you about that, you're not alone. You might have thought that B, the person who was bitten by the snake, might have been coerced, given the sort of dire situation they were in. But we have to be careful. A is not responsible for B's bad situation in this example. And there are a lot of cases in which desperate people still exercise their agency. And when they do so, we're morally obligated to honor their decisions. So imagine people consenting or not to life-saving surgery. Those are very desperate circumstances, but we have to honor people's decisions. Moreover, if we let desperate circumstances too easily undermine consent, this denies agency from a wide swath of people. If someone is very poor or desperate for other reasons, we're basically saying you don't have agency, your decisions actually don't matter that much. And that is a kind of disrespect, I think. That said, I'll say more about coercion and consent and this particular example in just a bit. So within the exploitation literature, there's a focus on MACE because it's the harder type of wrongful exploitation to explain. The question theorists ask here is, well, if all parties benefit from and consent to the interaction, then how can we say A has done something wrong? How can we say that A has wronged B when B is better off at the end of the day and has actually consented to be used in this way? Some theorists have posed this so-called non-worstness claim, which if true would seem to be a challenge to MACE theorizing. The non-worstness claim says it cannot be worse to interact with someone to their benefit and with their consent than to not interact with them, at least in the absence of negative externalities, that is, harms to third parties. And we often do think it's okay to just not transact with people, so how could it be worse to transact with them in a way that helps them? Well, MACE theorists tend to broadly agree with each other that A wrongfully exploited B whenever A had a threat advantage over B, meaning it was easier for A to walk away without transacting than it was for B to walk away. So in the case of antidote, for example, A can just walk away and not die, but if B says no to the transaction, B literally dies. And so the costs are much greater for B if they do not transact. So that's part of it. A has this threat advantage. But A must also leverage the threat advantage. A must use his stronger bargaining position to set the terms of interaction so that he receives too much of the social surplus, that is, too much of that good their transaction creates, while B receives too little. Theories do disagree on exactly what counts as too much or too little, but I don't need to engage with that literature too much. So, need to make a clarification here. If we're talking about harm or benefit in a transaction or an interaction of any kind, we must be assuming some sort of baseline by which to judge harm and benefit. Well, what is this baseline? We can refer to something called a non-transaction baseline, which is how well off each individual would be in the absence of the interaction in question. What if they just don't interact? That's the non-transaction baseline. That might not always be the best baseline to consider. For instance, what if B is owed A's assistance as a matter of moral duty? What if A is historically responsible for B's vulnerable position? It's considerations like this, sort of like moral considerations, which lead Wertheimer to say sometimes at least we also need a moralized baseline. This is a baseline that takes into account each party's morally informed, legitimate expectations. So, for example, philosophers sometimes talk about there being a duty of easy rescue. This is the idea that you need to take on small costs sometimes if in doing so you can bring about something very good, like saving a life. You should be willing to make small sacrifices to bring about great goods, at least sometimes. Well, let's say everyone has this duty of easy rescue. Well, then in that antidote case with the snake bite, A has a duty of easy rescue. And therefore, B is entitled to being rescued for free. This is going to inform B's moralized baseline, which means that if A says he's only going to help if B pays for it, then A is threatening to make B worse off compared to this moralized baseline that takes all these obligations into account. So what appeared to be MACE, mutually advantageous consensual exploitation, is actually a coercive transaction. A is essentially threatening to make B worse off than B is entitled to be. That was confusing. It's coercion, it's not MACE. A is making a threat, not an offer. So an upshot of this is that to validly see a potential case of exploitation as MACE, whatever it might be, and to use the status quo non-transaction baseline as the correct baseline in our reasoning, we have to assume something I've called no prior obligation. That is, we have to assume that A is, and whatever this example is, morally speaking, free to simply not transact with B. A does not wrong B by simply walking away, choosing not to transact. All of this is to say that it's really important where we keep our baselines, like where we're focused on our baselines, and we keep the right baseline in mind. Otherwise, what could look like, MACE, mutually advantageous consensual exploitation, could actually be something far worse. So returning to our two cases of global exploitation, let's look at sweatshop labor first. Some forms of sweatshop labor are clearly not mutually advantageous and consensual, without a doubt. So forced labor and child labor are not MACE. Neither one of those would have consent from the person being used. Other forms of so-called sweatshop labor, as I talked about it earlier, actually might be amenable to the MACE framework. A lot of people have thought so. While the pay is very low, it often exceeds that of local alternatives, many of which are undesirable in themselves. That means that these interactions are in fact mutually advantageous, or so many theorists have said. And perhaps because the pay is much better than local alternatives, it makes sense to say that people would consent to this. And you often hear people say that when one of these factories opens up, there are people lined up around the block trying to get this kind of work because it pays so much better than anything else they can get. So the question for theorists on sweatshop labor here then would be, well, what is a fair wage or wage package? What would be not exploitative? If it's not enough that everyone consents to and benefits from these employment transactions, then what more is needed? What counts as the right wage? Turning back to international clinical trials, you see something similar. Again, people want to apply this MACE framework to this other setting. Individuals and communities participating in research often receive health care they would not otherwise have access to. And because they have access to this benefit they would otherwise not get outside of research, it looks like it's mutually advantageous. Moreover, there's no reason sort of a priori to rule out the possibility that you could get informed consent from the participants in these trials and the host communities that are sort of like taking on this research. And so there's no reason to think these interactions could not be consensual. And so again, you have mutual benefit and consent. The question here is, how can sponsors from wealthy countries conduct non-exploitative research in LMIC populations? Must successful interventions be made available to participants and their communities after the trial? Are there other benefits that ought to be provided to communities beyond those that are needed to achieve their consent and the prevention of harm? It's important to note that exploitation theorists caution us not to demand too much. Why? Well, because by requiring something like a living wage for LMIC workers, or by requiring greater benefits to LMIC research participants and host communities, we actually risk erasing the comparative advantage of these countries and thus diverting these interactions away from them, costing very desperate people the benefits they would otherwise get. This is what Alan Wertheimer has referred to as diversion effects, which are a result of a self-defeating fixation on fairness and exploitation. The idea being that we're going to be so caught up in trying to protect people from being exploited, we're going to cost them the benefits they were getting, and now they might actually be worse off as a result. So we just have to be careful, says Wertheimer. And you see this worry a lot in the literature. So here is Matt Zielinski, who is actually kind of a skeptic about MACE, but nonetheless he features large in the literature. So he thinks that actions which could lead to less or no sweatshop employment will tend to disrespect worker autonomy. It kind of, disrespects the choice they've made that among their limited options they've chosen to work at these factories. And it also tends to harm workers by removing their chance to benefit. And so he says we should not engage in boycotts of sweatshop goods. We should not call for stronger labor regulations targeting sweatshops, and we should not even ask for the existing regulations to be better enforced, because any one of these actions could put sweatshop employment at risk, along with the benefits that go along with it. Here's Michael Cates, who is a very much MACE believer. He has his own theory of sweatshop exploitation. He says we must balance the demands of fairness on the one hand with those of worker welfare on the other, since one of the main objections to the very idea of a fair wage is that it makes sweatshop workers worse off by reducing the demand for their labor. Jeremy Snyder has said similar things about sweatshop, the sweatshop context, but here he's talking about international clinical research. He says the fact that mutually beneficial and voluntary human subject trials do something to help the potentially exploited party speaks to the need to consider the consequences of setting the bar on these interactions too high. So when you ask, well, okay, what exactly is a fair or non-exploitative wage? You're asking these theorists this question, what's fair? A common response is something like this: interacting non-exploitatively requires the stronger party to grant the weaker party greater or maximal benefits while not removing the stronger party's incentive to transact. Again, if corporations or research sponsors are deprived of such an incentive, then people in need in LMICs will lose out on important benefits. So again, we have to be careful not to ask for too much. So again, these folks are working on a kind of like interpersonal immoral exploitation, but they're very aware of the sort of facts of injustice in the world. So here's just a very small sample. History of colonialism and imperialism, vast global inequality across generations, unjust wars, powerful countries selling arms to and propping up illegitimate governments or helping overthrow legitimate governments. There's climate change, largely fueled by highly industrialized states, but making it worse for everybody. And even in what are supposed to be more cooperative ventures, like trade between more and less powerful nations, the powerful ones tend to set the terms so as to benefit disproportionately, despite already being far better off. So these theorists recognize these facts, and they even recognize that the kinds of bargaining disadvantages that LMIC populations face are at least in part a result of these kinds of injustice. So they allow that at least many people in LMICs are victims of injustice. They allow that at least many in wealthier countries are beneficiaries of injustice. But importantly, they want to theorize exploitation in a way that's kept separate from theorizing injustice and what to do about it. They want to set up what we call a division of labor. There's exploitation, and then there's injustice. These are two separate things. So here is Zelensky again. He says, I am treating sweatshops as a somewhat isolated moral phenomenon. That is, I am asking what we should do about sweatshops while holding most of the other conditions of the world, large inequalities of wealth among nations, severe poverty in the developing world, and a growing system of global capitalism. He says, I'm holding all those things constant. All of these things, he says, need to be addressed, but he says, my paper seeks to tell us what we should do about sweatshops in the meantime. Here is Cates again. He says, we are ultimately not interested in determining what sweatshop workers would be morally entitled to in a just world. Rather, we are interested in determining what a fair wage for sweatshop workers would be in an unjust world like our own. And here is Millam and Garnett on theorizing the ethics of international clinical trials. They say one question concerns the unjust structural features of society and what we are to do about them. The second question concerns what individual actors are to do in the meantime, including in their interactions with, say, sweatshop factories or international clinical trials. And so theorists ask what parties to global transactions ought to do while taking background injustice as a fixed point. Why? Why would you do that? Well, here's an answer. Obligations to address injustice fall on all of us, not just multinational corporations and major research sponsors. So these entities in particular are not obviously required to do more than anyone else, let alone within the context of these interactions. Moreover, even if B is a victim of injustice, B specifically, the person A is actually interacting with here, is not owed any more from A than any other victim of injustice. And so why would that affect the terms of their transaction? Thus, say these theorists, obligations to address injustice, quote, do not seem likely to affect the ethics of transactions against a background of injustice. So I think you're seeing what we call a division of labor in levels of normative theory. There's two levels in how we're doing our normative theory here. The first level asks what we're supposed to do about structural injustice with the goal of mitigating or ending it. The second level of our normative theorizing asks what should agents do specifically within their interactions or transactions. Things like sweatshop labor or international clinical trials, given the injustice of the world as it is. And they want to keep these two levels separate. Like that's the actual division of labor we're talking about here. You do one or you do the other. My co-author and I find two problems with the division of labor that you find within the exploitation literature. First, the project in level 2 there, that second level, is carried out in a way that we call overly isolated from the project in 1. By that we mean that it makes assumptions which could not be entertained by a serious recognition of the facts of structural injustice. Second, accepting those same assumptions functions to legitimize, protect, and reproduce the status quo injustice that's supposed to be targeted in that first level of theorizing. That was sort of like a high-level brief of each one. I'm going to go into each one in detail here. So I'll start with this problem of what we're calling over-isolation. And we should start by asking what it is theorists are assuming when they try to analyze sweatshop labor and international clinical trials as potential instances of MACE, that is, mutually advantageous consensual exploitation. And we suggest that this theorizing they're doing here is appealing to a fairly standard liberal framework of free and fair transactions. To say the parties here are free is to say that they're politically free. That is, they are not coerced into transacting or not. They're morally free. Somewhat like a party to the transaction could just decide not to transact. They're not morally required to transact. Again, as I said before, we're assuming what I called no prior obligation. A can simply walk away without harming B. And to say the parties are free, and to say that we're talking about fairness here, the fairness is a presumption in favor of allowing and recognizing as legitimate the results of consensual transactions. That's just to say there's a strong presumption in favor of recognizing these things as legit. If it were not for this presumption, theorists would not have to do so much work to show why they're problematic. So the presumption has to be everything's fine until you show otherwise. But we argue that this free and fair framework just doesn't apply. So A is morally permitted to carry out consensual transactions of their choosing with others, and we are required to respect the outcomes of these transactions only if A's holdings, and by holdings I mean the resources he's actually in possession of, only if A's holdings are actually just. Only then would we be required to respect the outcome of their transaction and say that A is definitely allowed to transact or not by his choosing. So for example, A is not morally permitted to sell a bike to C if that bike was stolen from someone else, D, regardless of whether A is the thief. And if C is buying a bike from A because A stole their previous bike, then clearly this is not just some free and fair transaction we should be inclined to accept. And yet, if to assume no prior obligation is to say that A is morally free to walk away with his current holdings, and if to say the transaction is mutually advantageous is just to say that B benefits compared to the scenario in which they don't interact, then we are taking the status quo of holdings as our relevant baseline. And in doing so, we're treating it as morally legitimate. Nonetheless, we've already said that the world is wildly unjust, and this surely poisons the legitimacy of current holdings. So just to be clear, what I'm not saying is that all legally recognized holdings are null and void. You might want me to say that, but I'm not going to say it. Sorry. What I am saying is that we can't simply assume that larger injustices have not undermined the acceptability of our party's holdings. If anything, it seems like the holdings would be more likely unjust than just, given the state of the world. And I think this is going to be compounded by matters of scale, which I'll get to in a moment here. Now, if you're one of these theorists, you might say, look, we're not assuming that A is necessarily entitled to all their holdings. We're not saying that. We're only saying that B is not especially entitled to any of A's things, such that this would somehow impact the moral acceptability of their transaction. And I think that this reply might be relevant in certain contexts of exploitation. But given other factors I'm about to discuss, it can't be used to justify that division of labor that theorists want to use in global exploitation. So treating global exploitation as mace also requires us to assume certain things about similarities between small-scale and large-scale exploiters. It seems to assume that small-scale exploiters like price gougers, like in the Antidote case or the snowstorm rescuer case I told you about, seems to assume that small-scale exploiters and large-scale exploiters, like multinational corporations and major research sponsors, are similarly situated with regard to morally relevant factors. Otherwise, we couldn't just carry the MACE framework over from the small scale to the large. But there's actually a number of crucial differences between small scale and large scale exploiters, and these result from the much greater power and wealth that large scale exploiters have. So power and wealth are, we might think, resources one might use to do something about injustice. Try to make some change to the fact of injustice. And we might also think that the greater one's ability to address injustice, the greater one's responsibility to do so. If you have more resources you could put towards addressing injustice, then you ought to do so. Morality requires it of you. This is something Iris Marion Young said a while back. Brian Berkey and others have said it more recently, but it's gaining steam. And it seems to be a problem because there is no obvious reason to sort of like a priori divorce these obligations to address injustice from the ethical evaluation of transactions. Why would we just assume ahead of time that these responsibilities to address injustice have nothing to do with what sweatshop workers should be paid? Also, I think another big fan of this idea would be Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. Perhaps you've heard of that. That is basically just this principle. So, oh, there he is. We focus more on a deeper and more overlooked difference between small and large-scale exploiters, which is that greater wealth and power allow large-scale exploiters to structure the very conditions in which exploitation occurs. And let me explain what I mean here. And let's look first at those small-scale exploiters. Okay? Small-scale exploiters take background circumstances as given. So in Antidote, by assumption, A is not responsible for B having been snake bitten. Okay? A did not cause that. We can assume A did not walk down the trail the day before throwing poisonous snakes around in hopes that the next day he could come back and exploit somebody. Let's assume that's not the case. Getting snake bitten is then a natural occurrence, and A happens upon it and realizes he can take advantage of B's bad situation. Similarly, with that snowstorm rescuer, A is not responsible for there being a snowstorm and the fact that B is stranded in it. A does actively seek out bargaining advantages in order to take advantage of them, but he does not create the bad circumstances himself. The situation is very different with large-scale exploiters. The bad circumstances that LMIC workers and research participants find themselves within, these are not naturally occurring circumstances. They are the results of intentional human choices, even if the intention wasn't or was not always to create inequality and need. Moreover, large-scale exploiters are not merely happening upon these bad circumstances in LMICs, nor are they merely seeking out these bad circumstances. Multinational corporations and research sponsors actively create and reproduce the unjust circumstances, providing them so much advantage in their interactions with LMIC populations. And I've got two examples of this structuration. So I'll start with the first one. It was a pretty recent event, happened at the end of last year. It's the corporate pushback against the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The goal of this legislation was to ensure that Chinese imports to the US were not produced using the forced labor of members of the systematically oppressed Muslim community in China. And it was going to require corporations to take proactive efforts to prove that their imports were not tainted by forced labor. The corporate response by the good folks at Coca-Cola, Apple, Nike, and a lot of other places was to lobby so as to water down the demands of the bill. Why? Well, because when doing business in China, as it turns out, it's incredibly difficult to know what all is in your supply chain, and so it's hard to know if your supply chain includes forced labor. Perhaps surprisingly, the corporate efforts did not succeed in this particular case. But nonetheless, I think this is a very interesting example. I think there's still an important lesson to be learned here. This bill targeted goods produced by forced labor, one of the really nasty kinds of exploitation. That's what this bill was targeting. And so it seems that if corporations are willing to put their power and their resources into defending their ability to benefit from forced labor, we can safely infer that they're using them to defend their ability to benefit from those kinder, gentler forms of exploitation that theorists are so much focused on. Our second example is the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement, the purpose of which was to get all WTO member states to recognize strong intellectual property rights, including patents on pharmaceutical interventions. So this was supposed to protect patent holders for certain drugs. Typically, pharmaceutical companies and wealthy nations were the ones who were going to get this protection. It was going to keep them from having to compete with cheaper generics produced in LMICs. But of course, LMICs often cannot afford these more expensive patented products, and yet they have a great need for them. So TRIPS did allow for so-called compulsory licenses. A member state could, under certain circumstances, request permission to make generics without the permission of the patent holder. However, the use of compulsory licenses, as it turns out, is broadly discouraged by economic threats made by the pharmaceutical industry and their accomplice governments against anyone requesting these licenses. So by using their significant power to promote and protect the strong intellectual property conventions of TRIPS, thus depriving LMIC populations of more affordable access to important pharmaceutical interventions, the pharmaceutical industry is responsible for directly engineering the background context in which participants and communities and LMICs decide whether to participate. Importantly, participation in and hosting research may well be beneficial compared to non-transaction, in part because the pharmaceutical industry has worked to deny LMIC populations more affordable access to important interventions. They are literally structuring the circumstances of what counts as a benefit or not. So looking back at this division of labor in normative theory, again, level 1, what's structural injustice and what do we do about it? Level 2, what am I supposed to do in my regular interactions and transactions? I can now clarify this first problem. Maintaining the division of labor takes no account of the fact that the powerful entities involved have actively structured and continue to actively structure the very settings in which these transactions take place. This structuring at least explains why, it partially explains why the terms sufficient to achieve consent are both so meager for LMIC individuals and communities, and yet simultaneously so beneficial compared to non-transaction. So in bracketing considerations of structural injustice, in theorizing exploitation, this important interaction between the sources of structural injustice and the background for individual interactions is lost. How am I doing on time?
It's about 5:50, so you're around about 45 minutes, but maybe 5-ish minutes more?
Okay, I can do that. So I want to talk a little bit about this second problem, and I probably won't get much further than that. This is the problem about what I called earlier inconsistency, and it's where we argue that this kind of theorizing doesn't just make bad assumptions. These assumptions serve an ideological function. And we are not, by the way, we're not arguing that the theorists are trying to promote injustice. or any sort of evil, nefarious things like that. We just think that their theorizing has this, does have this function, probably and almost certainly against their intentions. So first, we argue that this theorizing is ideological because it takes away our best tools for addressing injustice before the conversation has even started. So remember that if exploitation is taken to be merely advantage taking and not also advantage creation and maintenance, then we can't see an important source of obligations for powerful parties. And this means ignoring the fact that they've helped make it so that even very meager benefits are very real benefits compared to non-transaction. Hence why so many theorists say it's puzzling to try to figure out what could be wrong with these interactions given the seeming benefit and consent. Well, we've hidden the sources of the problem. Recall that to the question, what's fair or non-exploitative in these types of transactions, a common response was something like, well, interacting non-exploitatively requires the stronger party to grant the weaker party greater or maximal benefits while not removing the stronger party's incentive to interact. Remember that we don't want potentially exploited parties to lose opportunities to benefit. So our theory should not demand too much from the stronger party. Otherwise, you get those diversion effects I was talking about before. But now, if we ignore powerful entities' role in advantage creation and maintenance, if we just totally ignore the structuration that they engage in all the time, and if this means ignoring the fact that they've helped make it so that even meager benefits are very real benefits compared to non-transaction, and if our theorizing must ensure that LMIC individuals and communities can keep transacting so as to receive those meager benefits, our theorizing is then functioning to legitimize and recreate the very conditions which make exploitation possible. This protects the further accumulation of wealth and power by those who already hold more than their just share, and we're ensuring that those parties who are exploitable now remain so in the future. I think I might skip over some of this. I'll talk a little bit about this consent issue because it gets everybody's goat. The theorizing is also ideological because it conflates morally transformative and full consent. So think of it this way. We can all allow, perhaps, that impoverished individuals can give what we'll call morally transformative consent, meaning the fact that they voluntarily engage in this matters from the moral point of view. However, that's consistent with holding that continued deprivation undermines full agency, like a fuller sense of agency, your ability to make life decisions. So we think that if you live in better conditions, you're more empowered to reject inadequate offers. You have a fuller sense of agency than someone who is constantly living in need. By focusing on merely morally transformative consent and ignoring facts of structuration, we insulate exploiters from justice-based demands to offer interaction on more favorable terms, terms which could help these people realize a fuller sense of agency. So I'll just clarify the second problem here. The problem is that by treating exploitation as something occurring within these free and fair transactions, we deprive ourselves of even the ability to develop conceptual frameworks that adequately respond to a very unjust reality. Because any adequate conceptual framework will be inconsistent with those assumptions that most theorists make about the moral status of individual agents, the moral status of their holdings, whether they're just or not, and also how the parties, like relative positions to one another, have come to be. So the tendency to want to define the wrong of exploitation and abstraction from background injustice, not only does this distract us from the need to reform structures of injustice, it also confounds our very ability to do so. I should probably just stop there. So, yeah. Thank you.
All right, so we're now going to have some time for Q&A, and while we're doing that, we're also going to bring in the pizza we mentioned earlier so that people can have some of that while we're doing and ask questions.
Also, Mr. Gray, if you wouldn't mind people ask questions, could you repeat it back so that we can get it on the microphone?
Sure.
Any questions? Feel free to raise your hand. I also.
What do you start with?
I can start with a question. So, in your presentation, you mentioned corporations, and there seems to be an implicit assumption that corporations like Apple or Nike, or examples that you mentioned, act as individualized entities, and not entities that are responsible for numerous people who are reliant on them for their fair share, quote unquote. So, how does that come into the calculus of the decisions that you're talking about?
So who are the various parties you have in mind here?
So take Apple, for
Yeah.
example, right? Apple isn't acting as an individual entity. Apple is acting as an entity that's responsible for all of its shareholders, all of its employees, all of its customers, right? Now, clearly one could argue that they have varying levels of need, right, in comparison to those who are living in low-income countries or lower medium-income countries. And how do you include that into the calculus that of your decisions?
Good. I think it's a great question. It's something I try to address, or we try to address somewhere else in the paper, I think, and maybe this gets to what you're asking here. It seems like within these organizations, and you're right, these are massive organizations, right? And chances are there's many people who don't know what everybody else is doing at any one time, and it's certainly not the case that everyone involved at Apple gets a say about, you know, what the supply chain includes or doesn't. And so my thinking here is that within an organization like this, there are going to be people with much more power than others to sort of like decide where where they're going to source products and so on, what the supply chain is going to look like. To the extent that they have more decision power, they are going to be much more responsible. And so, yeah, I understand that it's not easy just to say it's Apple. But like there has to be something, I think, within the governance of the corporation, which could be like the agent, which is responsible for this. That's my own thinking, at least.
Joe?
How do you stay out of the weeds with your state can only carry out consensual transactions if they're holding for trust? Like, how do you avoid things like if you're born wealthy, all of your holdings are going to be unjust because you had all of these advantages throughout your life? Like, where do you define that, or how do you avoid defining that?
So your question is like, once we say that mass injustice infects holdings, it's going to affect what, everybody's holdings, I guess, or
Yeah, like how do you stay out of the weeds with who is able to consensually transact and who has unjust holdings and can't?
I see. Okay, so so if lots of people are holding on to resources like more than they have, others have less than they have, how are we going to keep it straight what counts as like consensual and what's going to count as effectively coercive? I tend to think there's not going to be a way to do that that's very clear cut. And that's actually a problem for the people we're criticizing. And so my thinking is that this MACE framework is just pretty much entirely inapplicable to these kinds of interactions. Yeah, I guess I didn't get to that. Yeah, boo MACE. That's where I'm headed. And so I think the onus is on the MACE people to say, oh no, these are in fact consensual transactions. I'm just saying we need to kind of figure out another solution here. Yes?
So, I wonder, there's an objection to these sort of, or a different way of phrasing that these are exploitative. And I wanted to know if your analysis sort of captures this or if it's a different aspect. So, in the examples that we were giving, we were defining the like dichotomy as being between like engage in the transaction and like no transaction of any kind happens, right? You either get the antidote or you don't. But it seems to me that in something like the sweatshop situation, like if we imagine a world in which nobody worked at the sweatshop, and the sweatshop didn't exist. The alternative wouldn't be those people never work another day in their life and can't provide for their families and everything's horrible. The alternative would be, they move to another form of work, or an industry with like local companies doing the same thing arises or something. Like, it seems like a false background.
Yeah, and okay, so to be clear, you're saying when folks say we divert resources away and therefore leave people really badly off, we're ignoring another possibility, which is, in fact, they just find some other way to be fine.
Right, especially given what you were talking about the power of the other member of the transaction to keep conditions that way. If they weren't involved, conditions presumably would not be kept that way.
Yeah, I think there's frequently an assumption made that without this kind of investment from multinational corporations or whatever, the situation would just stay bad. Like the same alternatives that they have right now to sweatshop would be the only things that remain. We would just be taking away an option, not opening up a door to new options. I think you're saying, why would we think that's true?
Right, given this structure creating aspect that the companies are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? It's like it might very well be the case that you're not getting alternatives precisely because the companies keep structuring things to prevent alternatives. And so, yeah, I think that's a again, I'm all for that. But no, I like the way you're saying. I like that the way you put it. Yeah. So hand here.
I was just wondering, since this idea is like big corporations or also prolongation, that's the transaction A transaction. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what those frequently pilot project or government action. Like you mentioned accomplice governments before, but I was wondering if you had any specific government thoughts on exploitation.
Like, what is the role? Are you asking sort of like what's the role of government in exploitation?
To analyze government actions under this sort of exploitation as exploited transaction framework, or what they do fundamentally differently from the different obligations?
I think that's a really good question. The good question is, what is given that the government has to be playing a role in some of this. Like it's what's being lobbied to either change or not change, sort of like international law or tariffs, this sort of thing. So can we just sort of kind of apply the same sort of exploitation framework to the actions of the government? Speaking for myself, possibly. I'm trying to think what that would look like.
Or would government be not necessarily party A, party C, that's not how involved?
Yeah, it certainly seems to be I don't know. Trying to think if there's a good way to describe what's happening. It's certainly none of the rest of the stuff would succeed. Like the structuration would not succeed without the help of the government. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what kind of room to make for that. I feel like that's something we kind of need to clarify in our paper, because you're right. We want to say that the governments are accomplices in this, and I think maybe it'd help to have a clear picture of what that role is exactly.
When you talk about consent, Robert Nozick comes to mind.
Yeah.
Which is basically his whole thought process about what you were talking about.
Yes.
People are familiar with him, but he was more, he was very libertarian and minimal government.
Yeah.
But getting to her question about government, I think a lot of this goes on in the United States and all over the world because it's basically very, very fundamentally created through governments and lobbies and groups. Because I think one of the biggest forms of exploitation that the government is doing currently is student loans. That is an exact form of exploitation because students really do not have a choice at this time to educate themselves if they don't want to end up working at McDonald's for the rest of their life. So, I mean, we're dealing with systems that are actually designed within our own country that leads to this type of exploitation, period.
Yeah, I think that's another reason. Good, so you're saying like we can actually think of excellent examples of where the government isn't necessarily even some, you know, like half the equation or maybe even an outside party. It might be like the primary driver of exploitation, like sort of government-backed student loans being one of these things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Student loans are exploitation. It was formed by the government. They know that.
Yeah, well, if you are, yeah, I hope the government listens to you. Financially, it would do me a lot of good. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And so this again sort of like puts pressure on us to say like how much the government can be involved in this kind of.
They are. They have.
Oh no, I agree.
They've
Yeah.
created a system through capitalism.
I'm just saying, like in our paper right now, we don't really talk about governments separately from like the fact that they're lobbied on behalf of some of these other parties.
They're actually, if you go specifically back to it, the very beginning of the reason of it.
Well, maybe. I'm not sure about that, but I agree that governments are complicit at the very least, and sometimes quite actively doing harm, like in the example you're talking about.
Talk about certain corporations trying to put up some things to enforce things in China or what. They can't really because it wasn't designed to be enforced. Even in the United States, enforcement is lacking in our government systems on many things.
Yeah, I mean, there actually was legislation in place which was supposed to prevent the import, I think, of anything made from forced labor, and it just wasn't. It wasn't easy to enforce, and it wasn't really being enforced. This was just sort of like, hey, let's do this specifically, you know, targeting Uyghur labor, and even that. But like even that was like, you know, too much, I guess, for corporations to stomach. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I was wondering if the NACE framework is so inadequate and creates these sort of paradoxes to resolve, do you have like another kind of systematic framework to analyze these issues, and like where would you go there?
So I'm glad you asked. No, it is like a nice like softball setting up my other work. So in another paper, I do say here's all of like my personal complaints. This is not co-authored work. Here's a lot of my complaints with this, what I call a micro-level framework, this kind of interpersonal framework. And I introduce an outline for a structural theory of exploitation. And so I personally find that emphasis on individuals like acting morally or not hides just how difficult sometimes it can be for most of us to, like, you know, avoid sweatshop goods or something like that. And so I tend to think we need to consider exploitation as just a feature of having a certain kind of social structure in place. Because again, like, once that structure is placed, we are going to be primed to act in specific ways. There's an incentive structure that's going to lead us to act in certain ways. It's going to be hard to avoid that. So the focus should be more on those actors who have the ability to change the structure itself. But I think that means moving away from this like interpersonal framework that a lot of people have found tempting. Yeah.
So I guess one thing that popped up when you were making your comment was the corporate welfare that is given by the government is many times greater than welfare to individuals. So I just thought that was an interesting point. And like the role that the government plays in that. But also I had a question. With respect to informed consent for the international clinical trials, how do you draw like the line of informed versus uninformed consent, considering the differences in education? You know, in a country where there is more education on medicine, for example, they would have better questions to ask to be informed, whereas in a country where they don't even have access to that medication at all.
Yeah. No,
And that is an excellent question. The question, if I understand it correctly, is like, how do we even decide, you know, given sort of facts on the ground, whether and when informed consent can be given in communities in which maybe there is like a low level of education. So there's a bit of a division of labor in the co-authoring of this paper. Sadly, my co-author, Professor Wenner, is the one who does more on clinical trials, and I do more on the sweatshop, so she would be the one to ask that question to. It's not my expertise. But I know people are engaged in that, and I can like give you her email address if you want, and then you could follow up with her for more information. I'm sorry, that's the best I can do, though. Yeah.
So during this talk, you covered like the lack or no lack of agency on both sides of this, and I was considering like in the modern world, like capital can flow between countries easily. I mean, like
capital, say that again?
in the modern world, capital can actually flow between countries.
Yeah.
Like McDonald's can open a McDonald's wherever.
Yeah.
Or Nike can send the money, can send the capital to like build a sweatshop in like in another country. But the people living in those low and middle income countries, they cannot move. Will that be considered like they cannot move to like a wealthier country to like, unlike for example, you can move capital between countries, but people cannot move between countries. So is that like limiting the agency of people in low and middle countries? Should that be taken into account?
So is the question, is their agency somehow?
By borders being closed to people and not to capital?
Oh, so, okay, so let me see if I get this. So, are people in these countries, is their agency compromised in some way by the mere fact that they have difficulty leaving those borders following the capital? Is that kind of it?
Well, like, yeah, when you say that people cannot like leave their countries where there's capital, the capital can actually come to their countries and bring them our, like, yeah.
I think that is, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's a good way of explaining just like the deepness of the bargaining advantage that these corporations have. It's like you're here and you can't leave. We can go wherever we want. We can purely dictate our terms to you. I think that is a way of getting at just like how much power the corporations have when they're setting these things up. You really can't ask for much because we could literally just go wherever. And in fact, what you find is you find some of these countries, they will set up special export zones, they're called. Perhaps you've heard of them, where it's kind of known in advance that some of the labor laws will be relaxed there. They won't be as heavily enforced. And it's just set up in such a way as to encourage foreign investment. And again, that's a way of saying, yeah, we'll go along with this. Just give us your terms, we'll do it, right? And again, that speaks to just how much power the corporations have. Other questions? Yeah.
So a lot of this, or like this is focused on LMICs. Is there a reason, like maybe like the stuff you talked about here doesn't apply to, let's say, like low-income people within like the U.S.?
I don't see why it would necessarily not generalize. So I mean, I should say that in the paper we're hoping to come up with more general guidelines for theorizing against structural injustice. We happen to be talking about structural injustice at the global level. again, ideally, I think it could apply at any level. We're just sticking with like two important cases in the literature, which are clinical trials and sweatshop labor. Yeah.
So maybe we'll have like one last question. After that, we'll hand out pizza to people. We'll thank Professor Gray, and we'll have maybe more of an informal like chat amongst about what we thought about it.
Go.
Like how much of the talk you made a split between small scale and large scale, and then you proceeded to kind of talk about large scale throughout for the structural intercut.
Yeah.
For small scale base or for small scale exploitation, does MACE still apply reasonably, or do you still think the structural theory is better for that?
Okay, so good question. So we say that MACE doesn't really apply in the case of large-scale exploiters because of the structuration they're able to engage in. Smaller scale exploiters can't structure their background circumstances. So should MACE apply there? I don't think in our paper we're committed to saying one thing or the other. I'm not sure that we have to be. In my own work, I tend to move everything more towards like a more structural account of exploitation and away from this interpersonal stuff. So that's always my tendency. That being said, even I leave open the possibility that like this kind of like snakebite or antidote snakebite example, you know, call it what if you want to call it exploitation, call it exploitation. I call it price gouging, and I call exploitation other things exploitation. But if you want to call that a certain kind of exploitation, fine. But don't assume that that's like the same exploitation you find everywhere else. I think that's what I would want to say. Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, let's thank the president.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for your questions.